as Mira has covered, I'm a PM for RabbitMQ at Broadcom, and I have the unenviable task of trying to balance the needs of our commercial customers with those of the open source community, which is an interesting challenge at times. And those of you that have been to the summit before will know me from for the updates that I've provided from within the Broadcom or VMware team. I'm going to cover that in the latter part of this presentation. But first, I wanted to cover, by way of a sort of a kick-off, the endurance of Rabbit, the kind of things that Rabbit has had to endure, had to survive over the last 17 years. And let's, to put this into context, Rabbit was brought into the world in 2007 in the midst of a global economic downturn, which might not necessarily be the most ideal way to launch or time to launch a new product. But then a product that has strong influences in the banking world at the time of a significant economic downturn might actually have been one of the things that has endured the survival of Rabbit going forward. But just taking a look at what's happened in the world since then, in 2008, we saw the first black American president of the United States. We've seen the rise of social media. Social media wasn't new, but it's something that definitely isn't going away and has continued to build through sort of 2011 with Snapchat, Slack, and TikTok. Then in 2016, the Brexit thing happened, and then a year later, he happened. Thankfully, well, not thankfully, actually, because something that affected all of us just 3 years later was that COVID thing. And then 2 years later in 2022, Queen Elizabeth II passed away. But thankfully, King Charles III was on hand to take over the job. And then, of course, since all of that, in fact, dating back to 2014, there's been this horrendous situation in the Ukraine and very obviously in various other parts of the world. But I didn't want this to be a history lesson because my history is pretty much condensed onto just that one slide. But I think it is worth just taking stock of the journey that we as humans have been on, certainly over the last 17 years. And Rabbit is no exception. Founded, as I said, originally by Rabbit Technologies. That was purchased by SpringSource, which was part of VMware in 2010. That was then spun out of VMware as Pivotal Software in 2013, which was then purchased back by VMware in 2019. And we were acquired by Broadcom just last year, which gets us to where we are today. So there's been plenty of corporate changes over the years. But Rabbit's endured some technological challenges and influences from the outside, probably starting at about 2011 with streaming, with Kafka being a thing. And then around about 2014, Amazon launched Lambda, which kind of accelerated the use of event-driven architectures for microservices. And then in 2015, we saw Apache Flink and Spark Streaming and saw the growth of stream processing. 2017, Event Mesh started to become more popular with some platforms like Azure Event Grid. And then around about 2020-ish, real-time ETL was enabled through technologies like AWS Glue and Apache NiFi. And we are also now seeing a fashion of event-driven AI models where models are triggered to make predictions or decisions in real time as new events occur for things like fraud detection. And of course, IoT is an ever-growing environment, event processing at the edge with IoT platforms like AWS IoT, Azure IoT Hub, and many others. But just thinking about all of those things, all of those technology influences on Rabbit, does that mean that Rabbit should be doing all of these things as well? Should it support an AI-driven stream processing at the edge for billions of connections with zero latency and 100% delivery guarantees? Should we be developing the moon on a stick for Rabbit? But in my opinion, and in some regards, Rabbit is already a bit of a Swiss Army penknife. It's got many, many tools for many different applications. And there is a danger because from my experience as a PM, if you spend all of your time copying competitors' products, looking over your shoulder, at best your product will only ever be a Me Too product. And that's constantly on the back foot and constantly compromised. So, if we shouldn't be copying what other products are doing, what should Rabbit be doing to survive the next 17 years? It needs to obviously play to its strengths. And one of Rabbit's enormous strengths is that it keeps things simple. The fact that it's pretty much self-contained, with the obvious exceptions of the Erlang dependencies. But I think its self-contained nature is just one part of it. For users that want to get going quickly and they just want a simple message queue, that's something that they can build on and grow. For all its strengths, very often its presence is kind of overlooked, I think. Certainly from my experience within VMware, there are no big bright bells and bright lights and noisy bells and things like that you might get in some fancy real-time in-memory database thingamidoodah. It's not that. It just quietly gets things done, which is why I mentioned that it's kind of overlooked. But I do see it as an enabling technology, albeit indirectly, and it's what I call innovation by stealth. The fact that Rabbit can actually quite dramatically influence the way that people work differently in a kind of stealthy way. And I'd like to explain this by way of an example that I was personally involved in. And it goes back about 12 years. Because 12 years ago, remote television production, media production was pretty different. It involved a hell of a lot of people, and you had to get a lot of those people in the right place at the right time during a production process. And that would be from location. You'd have a small army of people on location, right the way through to sorting out the content and then working on the edit in an edit suite. And very often, I've seen personally more people than you could think possible crammed into a small edit suite because they've all got ideas about how the content is going to be cut together. There was pretty much zero automation in terms of the workflow, and as a result of having to get all the people in the right place, no automation, production times were incredibly lengthy. They still are. Getting content turned around quickly to get it into your magic sprite box in the corner of your living room, it takes unbelievably long time sometimes. Video over IP didn't exist. It worked in the lab 12 years ago, but it didn't actually exist. It wasn't production ready. And as a result, people were still unbelievably taking memory cards and tape cassettes out of cameras, putting them in bags, sticking them on motorbikes, moving them around the country and the world, for them to then take that content, ingest it into storage servers for the editing production. And then when it got there, the content had to be ingested onto these storage servers manually. And as a result of that, there were some production tools out there, software production tools, but they were pretty clunky. They weren't connected. And any metadata that was captured as part of that process was either written on the back of a beer mat or on a script, which somebody would then take home to sell on eBay as a memento for that particular production. So metadata quite often went missing. At the time, I worked for a company called EditShare, which unsurprisingly was a storage company for the production of content. And EditShare had a suite of software solutions that ran natively on that storage server to help with the editing process. There was an application for managing and ingesting and logging content. But even though all of these applications lived on that same server, they didn't communicate with each other directly. Actually, they connected to a central database and had to constantly poll the database in order to get updates and to get metadata, which led to the obvious problem that as soon as you start adding more users are using more applications are putting more stress on their database. You can see where I'm going with that. Now, the team that developed these software applications, they were experts in managing video and audio content, as well as the storage that it was stored on. They were also experts in dealing with the metadata that went with that, and none of them knew anything about messaging. Why should they? It's not their core competency. They just wanted their applications to run more efficiently and actually be better integrated and better connected. They didn't know anything about exchanges, bindings, routings. They just wanted a simple message queue. And by adding Rabbit between their applications and some slight modifications to their client applications, they were able to create very, very simple queues for inter-application notifications. The immediate benefit of this, obviously, was the central database that I mentioned before. On that storage, that lost weight and focused purely on the metadata. And once the team had established that experience, gained that experience from messaging, they created an automation service that could handle repetitive tasks on the storage server. And this meant that for the first time, content could actually be ingested automatically, could be transcoded into different formats. You could even trigger automated quality control checks that would notify a user that was tucked up in bed overnight as the process was running, would notify the user that there was a problem with the content that needed addressing. All of this hadn't been done before. They also created a couple of other applications, one of which was a really simple web-based tool that allowed the producers, the creative people involved in the process, to make decisions about how the content looked, that would guide the editors in the edit suite, which meant you didn't have to get all of these people into one location all at the same time. The result? Production times were reduced, overall costs and efficiency, especially when it came to the human logistics side of things, they were also reduced. The net result of that was, low-budget reality TV made simple. Thank you very much, RabbitMQ. But the point that I wanted to make here is that Rabbit is an enabling technology to a new way of working. And yeah, there were other advancements at the time. There were some improvements around video storage, some around camera technology that made cameras cheaper. But I think it's quite impressive that a message broker that's born out of a global financial crisis should actually be partly responsible for Love Island. And that the team, and this is the really important bit, is that the team that developed that, they didn't need to learn a whole new skill set. They could continue to focus on their core competency. And I think it's that flexibility and ease of adoption that is partly responsible for the survival endurance of Rabbit. But I think there are other things that Rabbit can do going forward. And I think from a conversation that Mira and I had not very long ago, the growth of Rabbit and its success is very much developer-driven. But it's not just the developers that leverage RabbitMQ for their own problem-solving, like the example that I've just given. It's about those that manage, build, and contribute to the innovation of Rabbit itself. And that's many of you sat here in this room and that are attending this event. Certainly, in the run-up to the release of 4.0, we were seeing pretty much daily pull requests on GitHub. Many of those particular requests, certainly the ones towards the end of the release cycle, some of them didn't make it. They'll probably make it into subsequent releases, but we were kind of in danger of getting into a last-minute infinite PR loop of, oh, just one more, yeah, let's just squeeze another one in there. But my point is that there are so many great ideas that come from the community, and we should continue to nurture these ideas and make them grow. Nurture them to make Rabbit easier to use and to understand. Easier for developers that are not specialists in message brokers themselves. But as you know, there are plenty of people that, certainly plenty of users of Rabbit that are big enterprises that use Rabbit at scale, and they have resources in-house that truly do understand the core of RabbitMQ. So there's a balance. There's a balance that's needed to make things simple and easy to use, but also scalable and performant for those larger customers. And that's not an easy thing to deal with. It is quite a significant challenge, especially when there are bills to pay. And the elephant in the room, the Broadcom elephant in the room, the current owner of Rabbit, we need to ensure that Rabbit remains profitable enough to keep our current owners happy. And as you know, we build our own version of RabbitMQ, Tanzu RabbitMQ, and we have to continue to innovate into that, and we have to make sure that Rabbit remains competitive. We need to understand users' problems and pain points, and there may be some features that are requested by paying customers that will only be available in the commercial build of Rabbit. But that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be innovative contributions to the core of open source RabbitMQ, and the team within Broadcom will continue to do that. So that concludes my warm-up. And now for the bit you've all been waiting for, the update. You might need that. So, by way of I managed to get water on my glasses. How about that? Right, so part 2 after that short break. Just before I dive into some of the new stuff, I thought I'd just take a brief look back at what's happened over the last couple of years. I won't go into too much detail other than the fact that, as you can see, I think there's been some fairly sensible iterations of features, going back to September 22 with super streams, and continued to work on our OAuth support and integration. And then just last year, we saw the first native protocol rolled out with MQTT version 3. That saw some performance improvements, and we started to pave the way for the release of Capri. We continued on the Capri vein into February this year, and also continued to iterate on the native protocol work with its support for MQTT5, and also dipped a toe in the water for processing for streams with some simple filtering capabilities with streams. But that brings us to where we are today, which is 4.0. Hooray! It's out. It's finally out. The new release of Rabbit. Mira and I were conspiring to have some kind of confetti bomb thing, but apparently they don't have a very powerful Hoover in the hotel, and the confetti gets stuck everywhere. So just imagine confetti. Kaboom! I would like to say a massive congratulations to everybody involved in the rollout of 4.0. It goes beyond just the team at Broadcom, because, as I said, there have been so many pull requests, so many contributions to 4.0. There's too much to mention here in any detail. But I would like to make a very special mention to the Broadcom team in particular, who have done an absolutely stellar job of getting 4.0 not just out on schedule, actually slightly ahead of schedule, because we had hoped, my dream was to be stood here with Rabbit just released, and actually we're kind of ahead of the curve there, which is absolutely amazing when you consider the adversity that the team faced. As a result of the acquisition, there have been numerous tooling migrations almost weekly. In fact, it became a standing joke. It's like, oh, what's going to be the new curveball we're going to get this week in terms of platforms? But to deal with that, to get an ordinary release out, let alone a significant release like this, really does hold testament to to the team, the talent within the team. So, moving on from that, the headlines for 4.0, Capri, a new metadata store. This was previously available in 3.13 as an experimental feature, behind an experimental feature flag. Why did we need a new metadata store? Well, Amnesia, the outgoing metadata store, fundamentally didn't handle network partitions particularly well. Capri is built on the same raft consensus algorithm that's used in quorum queues, so we're very much building on proven technology here. We've discovered in testing that there are some quite significant performance improvements with Capri, especially when it comes to the management tasks. Things like deleting high numbers of exchanges and queues, they are performed much faster with Capri. And we're also seeing from testing that, no surprise, Capri can handle higher network latencies. But when you look at the performance of Capri and the stability that it provides for clusters across nodes that are potentially dispersed across things like multiple data centers, there are some quite good improvements there. And we shouldn't really be surprised. That's what Capri was built for. But it's just nice to see it. Certainly when it's being tested by a customer, it's quite reassuring. So I think there's definitely potential that we can build upon there. We had planned in 4.0 for Capri to be enabled by default, but we've changed that, and now it is a user selectable option, just to make it a little bit more flexible for the user to be able to enable it. I should also point out that fundamentally, if you've enabled Capri in 3.13, the Capri layout in 3.13 isn't quite the same as 4.0, and you can't really get from one to the other. So that's not a great idea. But when you do enable it in 4.0, export definitions and things like that, make as best a backup as you possibly can. There is a zero downtime in place automatic migration process within Rabbit to handle that migration automatically. Moving on from that, we've got AMQP 1.0, native AMQP 1.0. Now, as many of you probably know, Rabbit has supported AMQP 1.0 via a sort of a conventional plugin for some time, but because it was a plugin and the core of Rabbit was very much AMQP 091, there were compromises, much like the native MQTT work that we've done. This sort of builds on the same process, and this also means that we can embrace the functionality of AMQP 1.0 that much better. There are performance improvements. I'm not going to go into too much detail because David, my colleague, who's up next, I believe, he'll go into the details of that, and I certainly don't want to spoil his presentation. But yeah, there are some significant improvements to performance, more efficient connections, and we can now support dynamic topologies in the respect that previously definitions all had to be declared in advance. This can now be done via the client. And speaking of which, we have a Java and very soon a feature complete .NET client as well, coming out very soon. So moving on from that, classic mirror queues, they're gone. Oh my God, it's the end of the world. Classic mirror queues, oh my God. We really did remove them. But they were deprecated about 3 years ago. The queue itself remains in place when you upgrade to 4.0. There's a common myth, I think, that people some people were using classic mirrored queues because they thought that the queues had to be replicated onto every node in order to connect. That isn't the case. Rabbit deals with that. So you can publish and consume from any node. Classic queues, just because we're removing the mirroring bit, doesn't mean that classic queues are going away. Much like the work I mentioned with AMQP 1.0, we're not turning our back on AMQP 091. The same goes for classic queues. They still remain. It's just the mirrored bit. And if people want queue durability, we've got quorum queues and, of course, streams as well. Now, Stefan's presentation later on today goes into some details about how you can migrate to quorum queues from classic queues, and I think that's probably definitely worth a look in. And just to prove a point that quorum queues are being continued to develop, we've added priorities to quorum queues to make them better than they ever were. I think previously users had a range of about 255 priorities with classic mirrored queues. That's a lot of priorities, and if you're using all 255, you could ask yourself, maybe this could be a good opportunity to look at exactly what those priorities mean. Now, in fact, obviously, the JMS over AMQP1 specification declares just 10 priorities, 0 being the lowest, 9 the highest. That's what we've implemented for quorum queues. And some people might say, oh, what if I need more control? I'd say, well, maybe first of all, have a look at the definition of your priorities and what those actually mean. Could be a good time for a review, or potentially use more queues, or maybe listen to Stefan's presentation later on. We've added a default delivery limit to quorum queues. I think it's now 20. Previously, I think there was the risk that messages could get stuck in quorum queues. So now there is a limit, and I believe that is adjustable as well. We've defined priorities for single active consumers, so that if an active consumer is enabled, obviously no other consumer can become active at the same time. However, if a consuming client that may have been restarted actually has a higher priority, a higher importance than the currently active one, it wouldn't be able to consume messages without first disabling the currently active one. Now, with this new feature, the priorities defined are obeyed, and when the higher priority consumer becomes active, it will take over. And I just want to get to the last bit, because the last one, yes, we've improved the boot times with checkpoint files on quorum queues. No longer has to read all of the data from disk on boot. And yeah, there is a new exchange. The local, I couldn't think of a decent enough picture, so I thought I'd just put the text upside down. A local random exchange. This is mainly designed for request reply type use cases. Messages are always delivered to a local queue to reduce latency. But if you have multiple local queues connected to that same exchange, then one of them will be picked at random to deliver to. Now, going forward for beyond 4.0, one of the things that we're looking at is a more reliable and clearer release cadence. I think the releases to date have been a little bit ad hoc. So we've put some tight deadlines, well, not necessarily tight deadlines, but some better defined deadlines as to when we want to release versions, with 4.1 coming out next year in April, and then 6 months after. And our hope is that we'll stick to a 6-monthly cadence in terms of releases. If I'm stood here in 12 months' time and that hasn't worked, I'll be standing here saying that hasn't worked. But we'll see how it goes. I also think that beyond 4.0, we need to let the dust settle around Capri in particular, learn more about its behavior in as many different environments as we possibly can. And I think there are bound to be improvements that we can make on that. We're having a look at Shovel. We haven't actually started doing any work on it, but I think there is definitely some love that needs to be sprinkled upon Shovel. It's had a bit of neglect, and it's I think a much overlooked plugin. I think we're also going to build on the AMQP 1.0 work that we've released in 4.0. Certainly improving the observability within AMQP 1.0 specifically. There are some things that I think we need to add to that, certainly around our Prometheus endpoint, the management API and the UI, etc. But beyond the AMQP 1.0 stuff specifically, I think we need to take a look at the logs and the logging, the way that Rabbit handles logs, to try and make it easier for people to understand certainly when things go wrong, being able to get to the right logs and interpret them more clearly. There's some work we can do there. And the client libraries, we continue to work on these. I mentioned that certainly for AMQP 1.0, we've got a new Java .NET client. The .NET client is available, but I don't think it's quite feature complete yet, so there'll be iterations of that. The Stream clients are available for numerous languages, and we will continue to build on those languages, on those clients. And I think also quite an important bit of work that we need to do going forward beyond 4.0 is an education. The adoption of streams isn't perhaps quite as broad as we would like. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything's wrong, other than the fact that we're not making it easy for people to understand what streams bring, how to implement them. So I think some tutorials and educational information around streams is definitely worth some work, as well as how people can get the most out of AMQP 1.0 as well. And again, I think as long as we don't make it obvious, don't make it sound like AMQP 1.0 is the new best thing and 091's going away and everything's terrible. It's an iteration, and I think some people may see some benefits. So just to wrap up, none of us, as I hope you've seen from this presentation, as we all know as human beings, none of us know what's around the corner. There isn't a single solution or magic potion to long-term success for Rabbit, but I think as long as there's continued innovation through the community and at the core of RabbitMQ, I think we can continue to solve real problems for users and customers alike. There's no reason why Rabbit shouldn't continue to be one of the most widely used message brokers out there in the world. And I think one of the most important things is that it also doesn't matter which corporate entity owns Rabbit. It can't diminish, can't take away or suppress the spirit of the community that contributes to Rabbit and has contributed fundamentally to the success of Rabbit. And you can all breathe a sigh of relief. That's it. Have we caught up any?
All right. Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any questions for Howard? We have time for a question, so if someone has one. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Howard. That was great. I think we're all really excited for Kepri, but it seems we're not quite there. So what can we as a community really do to help test, or what specific scenarios can we put it through to help it develop into the actual production-ready phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right in the respect that we're not quite ready, because with all the best will in the world, there's no way we can replicate. There's a core team. There's no way that we can replicate every single scenario that's ever likely to come into being. So I think my answer to that question is, in terms of what can a community do, get creative. Get creative in the respect of pushing Capri into the kind of scenarios. If you know of a scenario where amnesia would curl up in a corner and die, then go through exactly that and actually maybe make it worse, make it harder, and give us feedback. Certainly, from some of the testing that we've seen around, high latency network environments, Capri seems to be holding up really well. In fact, I know of at least one customer that has tried it across different data centers with fairly high latency, and they haven't seen a single node sort of curl up and die. So yeah, that sort of thing. And I think also the upgrade process, there may be some work that we need to do to try, to ensure that goes smoothly. Again, with the best will in the world, I don't think we can cater for every single configuration, every single topology that anybody's ever thought of.
All right, well, let's thank Howard again.
Thank you.